I've spent most of my working life as a security guard. It's not exactly the kind of career people dream of, but for me, it worked. It paid the bills, kept food on the table, and gave me a sense of purpose, even if the job itself wasn't exciting. Over the years, I've bounced from one assignment to another: gas stations, convenience stores, small shops, places where most of the time, you're just sitting in a corner, keeping an eye on things. Some nights were so quiet, I'd wonder if I was being paid to just exist in a uniform. Still, when I stumbled across an ad for a night security position at the local mall, I couldn't help but feel like I'd hit some kind of jackpot. It wasn't the kind of job you saw every day, and the details immediately caught my attention. The pay? Far better than anything I'd seen in years. The hours? 11 p.m. to 6 a.m. Not exactly ideal, but manageable. The location? Convenient, only a short drive from my apartment. And the workload? Just one building, no rotating shifts, and I figured most of the time, it would be dead quiet. How hard could it possibly be? I envisioned myself stationed in a well-equipped security office, sipping coffee while monitoring a few grainy screens. Every now and then, I do a leisurely patrol around the empty halls. Easy money. Without a second thought, I sent in my application. That same evening, I received a call. It was the mall manager, Mr. Hensley, asking if I could come in for an interview the next day. His tone was polite but brisk, as if he was in a hurry to fill the position. I agreed immediately. I wasn't about to let this opportunity slip through my fingers. The following afternoon, I made my way to the mall, eager but slightly uneasy. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the quick turnaround felt off. Why were they moving so fast? Was the mall that desperate for a night guard? I tried to dismiss the thought as first-day jitters. When I arrived, the mall was bustling with its usual crowd. Shoppers darted from store to store, their arms laden with bags, while kids darted between the displays, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. It looked like any other mall, bright, busy, and full of life. I couldn't help but wonder what it would look like at night, stripped of its daytime energy. Mr. Hensley's office was tucked away near the staff entrance, a modest space crammed with filing cabinets and a desk overflowing with paperwork. He greeted me with a firm handshake and got straight to business. The interview was short, almost rushed. He asked me about my previous jobs, nodding occasionally but not seeming particularly interested in my answers. Instead, he seemed preoccupied, his gaze occasionally flicking to the clock on the wall. After what felt like only a few minutes, he outlined the basics of the job. You'll check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, he explained, and do hourly patrols. Keep an eye out for anything unusual, but don't worry, it's usually quiet. His instructions were straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, at the end of the interview, he asked, "Can you start tonight?" The question caught me off guard. Most places required at least a few days to process paperwork, maybe run a background check. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. "Sure," I said, trying not to sound too eager. Hensley's shoulders seemed to relax. "But we're short-staffed," he admitted, rubbing his temples. His voice dropped slightly, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "The last few guards didn't stick around. I hope you'll be different." That statement lingered in my mind. What did he mean by "didn't stick around"? Were they fired? Did they quit? Something about his tone unsettled me, but before I could press him for details, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single key and a laminated sheet of paper with a list of instructions. "Report at 11 p.m. sharp," he said, his tone firm but polite. "The sooner you start, the sooner you'll get paid." I nodded, shook his hand, and left the office. As I walked back through the mall toward the parking lot, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. Maybe it was the way Hensley had rushed through the interview, or the cryptic comment about the previous guards. But I brushed it off. It was probably just nerves. When I got home, I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and tried to relax. My shift wouldn't start for a few hours, so I had time to unwind. But as the evening wore on, a sense of unease began to creep in. The more I thought about the job, the more questions I had. Why had the last guards left? And why was the mall so desperate to fill the position? By 10 p.m. I had showered, dressed, and was ready to leave. The envelope sat on the counter, the key glinting under the harsh kitchen light. I grabbed it, along with the laminated instructions, and headed out the door. The drive to the mall was uneventful, the streets quiet and bathed in the soft orange glow of streetlights. But as I pulled into the parking lot, the sight of the empty mall sent a shiver down my spine. During the day, the parking lot was packed, a sea of cars surrounding the massive building. Now, it was almost entirely deserted, save for a few scattered vehicles parked under the dim glow of the lot's overhead lights. The mall itself loomed in the darkness, its windows dark and lifeless. For a moment, I sat in my car, staring at the building. Something felt wrong. I shook off the unease as best as I could, telling myself it was just the nerves of starting a new job. After all, it wasn't uncommon to feel a little apprehensive when stepping into the unknown. I grabbed the laminated instructions from the passenger seat, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The air was crisp, the kind of chill that felt heavier in the absence of daylight. My footsteps echoed faintly as I crossed the lot, the sound swallowed by the vast emptiness around me. The mall loomed larger with every step, its silent facade almost oppressive. By the time I reached the employee entrance, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be standing behind me. But there was nothing, just the empty parking lot stretching into the shadows. I knocked on the steel door marked "Staff Only," and within moments, it creaked open. Mr. Hensley stood there, his face half lit by the dim light inside. He didn't say much, just gave me a brief nod and motioned for me to follow him. The staff corridors were a stark contrast to the bright, bustling mall I'd seen during the day. Narrow and dimly lit, they twisted and turned like a maze, lined with plain white walls that felt too clean, too sterile. The faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead only added to the unsettling atmosphere. "This way," Hensley said, leading me through the winding hallways. As we walked, he repeated the same instructions he'd given me during the interview. Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, do hourly patrols, and report anything unusual. At first, I thought he was just being thorough, but the way he emphasized certain words made me wonder if there was something he wasn't telling me. "Make sure you're paying attention," he said at one point, his tone firmer than before. "And keep an eye on the escalators and the play area. Things tend to happen there." I almost stopped in my tracks. "Things happen?" I asked, my voice betraying my confusion. He waved a hand dismissively as if brushing off the question. "Kids, mostly," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Sneaking in, messing around after hours. You'll see." I nodded, though his vague response only heightened my unease. The security office was tucked away at the very back of the mall, a cramped room filled with screens displaying grainy black and white footage from the cameras scattered around the building. The walls were bare except for a small corkboard pinned with memos and a clock that ticked far too loudly in the silence. "This is it," Hensley said, gesturing toward the desk and chair in the center of the room. "You'll be spending most of your time here." I stepped inside, taking in my surroundings. The office smelled faintly of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, a combination that wasn't entirely unpleasant but felt strangely out of place. The monitors flickered occasionally, their images distorted by static. I couldn't help but notice that the camera angles seemed odd. Some of them were tilted just enough to leave parts of the mall out of view. "Check the cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, Hensley reminded me for the third time. "And don't forget to do your rounds. Keep everything in order." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Oh, and one more thing. Make sure you follow the rules." I frowned. "The rules?" He pointed to the laminated sheet I was holding. "They're important." I glanced down at the paper. It listed the same basic protocols he'd gone over earlier, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, The way he spoke made it sound like there was more to it. Before I could ask, he handed me a second piece of paper. This one wasn't laminated, and it looked like it had been crumpled and smoothed out several times. "And this," he said, his voice lowering. "Keep it with you. You'll need it." I unfolded the paper, half expecting it to be a joke. But as my eyes scanned the list of rules written in neat, almost mechanical handwriting, my stomach tightened. Rule 1. Check the security cameras every 15 to 30 minutes, but don't stare at the footage for too long. Rule 2. Never look directly at the mannequins after midnight. If they change position, leave the area immediately. I stopped reading, my pulse quickening. "What is this?" Hensley didn't meet my eyes. "Just follow them," he said, his tone flat. "It's for your safety." "For my safety?" I repeated, incredulous. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, I know it sounds strange, but this place has quirks. You'll understand soon enough." I wanted to press him for more information, but the look on his face told me I wouldn't get any answers. Instead, I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, trying to hide the growing unease bubbling in my chest. Hensley checked his watch. "It's almost time." "Good luck," he said, extending his hand. I shook it, though his grip felt colder than it should have. "I'll see you in the morning." With that, he left, the sound of his footsteps fading into the distance. I stood there for a moment, alone in the silence of the security office. The faint hum of the monitors filled the room, their flickering images casting shifting shadows on the walls. I took a deep breath and sat down at the desk, trying to steady my nerves. "This is just a job," I told myself. "Nothing to worry about." But as I glanced at the crumpled list in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just stepped into something far beyond what I'd signed up for. By the time Hensley's footsteps had completely faded, the silence of the mall seemed almost deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet you associate with peace, it was the kind of quiet that wrapped around you, amplifying every small sound. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed intermittently, and the occasional pop from one of the monitors felt like a gunshot in the stillness. I settled into the chair, trying to shake off the unsettling vibe. The office, small and cramped, offered little comfort. The grainy black and white footage on the monitors flickered as I cycled through the feeds. The escalators were still, their mechanical hum absent. The food court, normally buzzing with activity, sat like a ghost town. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the tiled floors, making even the most mundane objects seem vaguely sinister. I glanced at the laminated sheet Hensley had given me earlier. It was nothing special, just standard instructions: conduct hourly patrols, check the cameras regularly, report any suspicious activity. Easy enough. But the crumpled paper in my pocket? That was another story. I unfolded it again, the paper crackling loudly in the otherwise quiet room. The first two rules were etched into my mind already: don't stare at the footage for too long, and avoid looking at the mannequins after midnight. The absurdity of it all made me want to laugh, but the memory of Hensley's serious expression stopped me. Reluctantly, I read the next few rules. Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. They stop if you ignore them. Rule 4. Avoid looking into the restroom mirrors at all costs. Rule 5. If you hear someone talking inside an abandoned store, do not listen. My stomach churned as I stared at the list. It read like the setup for some kind of elaborate prank. Surely, this was just some sick joke to mess with the new guy. But if that was the case, why had Hensley looked so unnerved when he handed it to me? I shook my head, folding the paper and shoving it back into my pocket. Dwelling on it wasn't going to help. I turned my attention back to the monitors, cycling through the feeds. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as an empty mall could be. The first hour passed without incident. I made my first patrol, flashlight in hand, and walked the main hallways. The echoes of my footsteps bounced off the high ceilings, making it sound like someone was following me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of those mannequins Hensley had warned me about. But the mannequins were just mannequins, standing lifelessly in the windows of the clothing stores. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that their blank faces were watching me. Their painted eyes, frozen in artificial expressions, seemed to follow me as I walked past. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head. The children's play area was my next stop, a bright and colorful section of the mall that looked almost cheerful in the dim emergency lighting. Plastic slides and climbing structures sat unused, their bright colors muted in the darkness. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, before moving on. By the time I returned to the security office, my nerves were beginning to settle. The rules were bizarre, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary had happened yet. I told myself the night would be smooth sailing. But then, just after midnight, I noticed something on one of the monitors. The escalators. They weren't moving, at least not yet, but something about them felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. The image on the screen was as still as it had been before. But the longer I stared, the more uneasy I felt. I remembered Rule 1, don't stare at the footage for too long. Shaking my head, I flipped to the next feed. The moment the escalators disappeared from the screen, the oppressive feeling eased, as though I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. I leaned back in my chair, trying to shake off the unease. That's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. My pulse quickened as I glanced at the hallway outside the office. It was empty, just as it had been before. Still, the sound persisted, growing louder. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from one of the clothing stores. Grabbing my flashlight, I forced myself to step out of the office. The cold air of the mall hit me like a wall as I made my way toward the source of the noise. My flashlight beam swept over dark storefronts, illuminating mannequins posed in rigid stances behind the glass. That's when I saw it. One of the stores, a high-end clothing boutique, had its door wide open. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The door wasn't supposed to be open, I was certain I'd locked it during my patrol. I stepped closer, shining the light into the store's interior. At first, nothing seemed out of place. The racks of clothes were untouched, the displays neatly arranged. But as I swept the beam toward the back, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head, the flashlight following my gaze. The mannequins. They hadn't been there before. 3 of them stood near the back of the store, their blank faces tilted ever so slightly toward me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. They were just mannequins, I told myself. Just lifeless pieces of plastic. But then one of them moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I took a step back, my flashlight beam trembling as I struggled to keep it steady. "Hello," I called out, my voice cracking. "Is someone there?" No answer. The mannequins remained still, their painted faces eerily serene. I backed out of the store, not daring to take my eyes off them until I was safely in the hallway. As I turned to walk away, I heard it again, the shuffling sound, followed by the distinct creak of joints moving. I didn't look back. My pace quickened as I moved away from the open store, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the hollow expanse of the mall. The shuffling noise I'd heard moments earlier was gone, but the memory of it clung to me like a second skin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting one of the mannequins to appear in the hallway behind me. When I finally reached the security office, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breath. The flickering monitors greeted me with their distorted images, but I couldn't bring myself to sit down right away. Instead, I leaned against the desk, clutching the edge with trembling hands. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket, unfolding it with shaking fingers. The words stared back at me, their stark black ink now carrying a weight I hadn't felt before. I scanned the rules again, my eyes lingering on Rule 3. If a mannequin looks like it's following you, don't look back. They stop if you ignore them. I had looked back. The thought sent a chill down my spine. What had I unleashed by breaking that rule? The memory of the mannequin's slight, unnatural movement replayed in my mind over and over, like a tape on an endless loop. Trying to calm my nerves, I focused on the next rule. Rule 4. Avoid looking into the restroom mirrors at all costs. This one seemed even more bizarre than the others. What was it about the mirrors that warranted such a specific warning? My reflection? Something lurking on the other side? I didn't want to find out. I flipped through the camera feeds, my eyes darting from one screen to the next. Everything appeared normal, or at least as normal as an empty mall could be. The escalators were still. The play area was deserted. The hallways stretched on in their eerie silence. But then, as I cycled through the feeds again, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of the mannequins was in the hallway. I froze, my hand hovering over the keyboard. The grainy footage showed the same mannequin I had seen in the clothing store, now standing motionless in the middle of the corridor. Its blank face was tilted slightly upward, as if staring directly at the camera. My mind raced. Had it moved on its own? Or had someone, or something, placed it there? The thought of stepping out of the office to investigate made my skin crawl, but the rules were clear. If a mannequin appears to follow you, don't look back. Ignoring it was my best option. I took a deep breath and switched to another camera, trying to focus on anything else. But no matter which feed I chose, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hours dragged on. Every minute felt like an eternity as I cycled through the feeds, my ears straining for the slightest sound outside the office. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the unease never left. At one point, I glanced at the clock. It read 2 a.m. halfway through my shift. I leaned back in the chair, the tension in my shoulders refusing to ease. Suddenly, a faint sound caught my attention. It was coming from one of the monitors, a soft, rhythmic hum that grew louder with each passing second. The escalator. I flipped to the camera feed for the escalators, my heart pounding. One of them was moving. The mechanical steps churned slowly, their usual hum now distorted and uneven. My first instinct was to leave the office and check it out, but then I remembered Rule 10. If you hear an escalator running, do not investigate. Watch the area on the security cameras. I kept my eyes glued to the monitor, the flickering image sending waves of dread through me. For a moment, the escalator seemed empty, its steps cycling endlessly into the darkness. But then a figure appeared at the top. It wasn't human. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its spindly frame. Its head tilted at an odd angle, its face obscured by shadow. The way it moved, jerky, almost mechanical, made my skin crawl. I swallowed hard, my hand hovering over the radio in case I needed to call for help. But who would I call? And what would I even say? The figure descended slowly, its movements unnatural and deliberate. When it reached the bottom, it paused, its head turning ever so slightly toward the camera. I gasped, my heart leaping into my throat. The figure seemed to stare directly at me, its blank face filling the monitor. Then, as if sensing my fear, it began to move again, this time toward the security office. I snapped my gaze away, remembering Rule 1. Don't stare at the footage for too long. When I glanced back a moment later, the screen was filled with static. The loud buzzing noise that accompanied it made me wince, the sound grating against my ears. And then silence. The escalator feed returned, but the figure was gone. My pulse raced as I cycled through the other cameras, searching for any sign of it. The hallways were empty. The escalator was still. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air. I leaned back in the chair, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands trembled as I reached for the crumpled paper, rereading the rules in a desperate attempt to ground myself. The rest of the night was a blur of tension and paranoia. Every sound, every flicker of the monitors felt like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time the clock struck 4 a.m., I was ready to lock the door and wait out the rest of my shift in silence. Rule 8 was clear. Lock the security office door between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. and do not open it for anyone. If they knock, they might not be who you think they are. I double-checked the locks and sat back down, my eyes fixed on the monitors. The mall was quiet again, but the oppressive atmosphere lingered. Then, at 4:03 a.m., there was a knock at the door. The knock at the door was soft at first, almost hesitant, like someone testing the waters. My heart stopped as I sat frozen in my chair, staring at the security monitors. The hallway outside the office was empty, or at least that's what the grainy footage showed. "Hey, everything okay in there?" The voice was calm, familiar. It was the janitor, the same one I'd met earlier in the night. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as sandpaper. Rule 8 flashed in my mind. Do not open the door for anyone between 4 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. If they knock, they might not be who you think they are. Another knock, this one louder and more insistent. "Come Ahmed. It's me. Just wanted to check on you." I glanced back at the monitors, scanning the feeds for any sign of movement. The hallway remained eerily still, but the voice continued, growing more persistent. "Open up. You're not scared, are you?" There was something off about the way he said it, something that made my skin crawl. It was the same voice I'd heard earlier, but the tone was different. Mocking, almost cruel. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. This was just another test, I told myself. Another trick. I wasn't going to let it get to me. The knocking stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the voice came again, softer this time. "Please. I just want to talk." I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I glanced at the clock. 4:28 a.m. Almost there. The knocking resumed, louder and more forceful than before. The door rattled on its hinges, the sound echoing through the tiny office. My hands gripped the edge of the desk as I tried to steady my breathing. And then the voice changed. It wasn't the janitor anymore. It was Hensley. "Open the door," he demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. "Your shift's over. Let me in." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. Could it really be him? The clock read 4:30 a.m. now. The rule was clear, after 4:30, the door could be opened. But I didn't trust it. Not yet. I checked the monitors again, flipping through the feeds until I reached the hallway outside the office. Hensley was standing there, his expression impatient as he stared directly into the camera. "Open the door," he repeated, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. I wanted to believe it was him. I wanted to believe that this nightmare was finally over. But something about the way he stood there, so still, so unnervingly calm, made my stomach churn. I stayed put, my hand trembling as I reached for the crumpled list of rules. My eyes scanned the paper, desperate for some kind of guidance. Rule 11. Under no circumstances should you leave before your shift ends. If you do, you risk something following you outside the mall. I glanced at the clock again. 4:32 a.m. It was safe to open the door now. Wasn't it? Hensley knocked again, harder this time. "You're wasting my time. Open the damn door." I hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally mustering the courage to speak. "How do I know it's really you?" The figure on the monitor tilted its head slightly, as if amused by the question. Who else would it be? The voice was perfect, identical to Hensley's, but the subtle mocking undertones sent chills down my spine. I shook my head, stepping away from the door. "I'm staying here until 6 a.m. If it's really you, you'll wait." The knocking stopped abruptly. Silence filled the office, thick and oppressive. I stared at the monitor, watching as the figure outside slowly began to change. Its features blurred, its form twisting and stretching until it was no longer recognizable. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. My legs felt like jelly as I collapsed into the chair, my entire body trembling. The clock read 4:40 a.m. now. Just an hour and 20 minutes to go. I cycled through the camera feeds again, my eyes darting from one screen to the next. Everything seemed quiet, too quiet. The mannequins were back in their stores, the escalators were still, and the play area was empty. But the silence didn't bring comfort. It felt like the calm before a storm, the kind of stillness that makes you question whether you're truly alone. At 5:15 a.m., the crying started. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the monitors. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more desperate. A woman's voice. I closed my eyes, clenching my fists as I tried to block it out. Rule 9. If you hear someone crying in a dressing room, do not open the door. The crying continued, echoing through the speakers. It was coming from one of the stores near the food court. The camera feed showed nothing unusual, but the sound persisted, filling the office like a haunting melody. I turned the volume down, but it didn't help. The crying seemed to seep into the very walls, impossible to ignore. Just a little longer, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. Just make it to 6 o'clock. The clock ticked on, each minute feeling like an eternity. The crying stopped abruptly at 5:45 a.m., leaving behind a silence that was almost worse. I cycled through the feeds one last time, my eyes heavy with exhaustion. The mall was as lifeless as it had been all night. Finally, the clock struck 6 a.m. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me like a wave. My shift was over. I grabbed my things, checking the hallway monitor one last time before unlocking the door. Hensley was standing there, his expression a mix of concern and impatience. Rough night? He asked, his voice normal again. I nodded, too exhausted to explain. You could say that? He frowned. You look like you've seen a ghost? I forced a weak laugh, shaking my head. Something like that? As I handed him the keys and walked out of the mall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whatever lurked in that place, it wasn't finished with me. Finally, the clock struck 6 a.m. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me like a wave. My shift was over. I grabbed my things, checking the hallway monitor one last time before unlocking the door. Hensley was standing there, his expression a mix of concern and impatience. Rough night? He asked, his voice normal again. I nodded, too exhausted to explain. You could say that? He frowned. You look like you've seen a ghost? I forced a weak laugh, shaking my head. Something like that? As I handed him the keys and walked out of the mall, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whatever lurked in that place, it wasn't finished with me. If you've ever worked a job like this or experienced anything that defies explanation, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed hearing about my nightmarish shift, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Who knows? Maybe next time, the story could be about you.